Hey there, and welcome to painting the sunset and sunrise light. So in this module, we're going to be going through a demo of creating the illusion of sunset or sunrise light, that extreme lighting situation. So I'm working on a toned panel. It's got that golden color ground that is the color of light at that time of year. And I'm working with the Terra Vert and Egyptian Violet mixture for the shadow color, the darkest one of the two that we've mixed. And again, just a quick reminder that the reason that we're using the Violet Terra Vert mix, even though this photograph is of a winter scene, is that the color of the light at that time of day is a warm, warm yellow-orange. And it's going to require the complement and create the complement, which is more of a violet, even to a red violet in some cases, color in the shadow areas. So the shadows are going to be almost always the complement of the color of the light. In this case, that warm yellow-orange light. So here you see me blocking in the shadow area first, the no-tan area of the picture plane. Very, very thinly. Note that you can still see the color of the panel through that no-tan color in many places. So I'm working with the knife held almost parallel to that panel. Notice that it's held very lightly, not pressing down much at all. When you hold it lightly like that and press very, very little, pulling it parallel to the panel or your painting surface, it means that a very thin layer of paint gets applied and it will naturally skip across that surface to a degree. When it skips, it creates soft edges and more irregular edges that mimic the way that the texture of the small limbs and the leaves on that tree line, that hedgerow, show. So try to let go a little bit as you're making those marks and allow some of those softer, more fuzzy edges appear quite naturally. So one of the keys to painting loosely is letting go. Hard to do at times, but you want to try to let go enough that you get some irregular, spontaneous marks. And here I've picked up the smaller knife and I've gone back in to push up some of those trees that you can see that are a little denser along that far distant tree line. Then picking back up the large knife in order to keep working that no-tan and develop it so that the main masses of the no-tan, the shadow color, are blocked in. In between, make sure that you wipe both of those knives very, very carefully. So remember, I like to take a half sheet of a paper towel. You know I love Bounty. Tear them in half so that basically I have a quarter sheet. And then I fold as I go so that I'm not getting paint all over me. So now that we've established the darkest darks, I'm going to block in the lightest lights with that ultramarine blue, phthalo blue mixture right across the top. I'm going to make the blue a little more irregular than what you see in the photograph. The photograph is slightly distorted and creates a little bit of a blue line, and we don't want to have a line that's that hard in the actual painting. So you can see that just as the violet green color was put on very thinly, I'm also putting on that blue very thinly. So all of those first layers, as you're blocking in, need to be very thin so that you can almost see the color of the panel through that first layer of paint. When you do it that way, it leaves the paint thin enough that you can put another layer on top without picking up that underneath layer. Notice that I make a mark, leave it, and wipe. Make a mark, leave it, and wipe. So there I have the top part of the blue established, and I'm going to reach for the next color as we work down the sky. And that next color is that phthalo blue and Indian yellow mixture. There's a tiny little bit of ultramarine blue in there. Remember what was on the back of the knife. And I'm just applying it really loosely. And just like I held the knife previously, I'm holding it almost parallel to the surface of the panel. But in order to blend, I'm actually putting just a tiny little bit more pressure on it. So notice where I have my finger. That helps me control where the knife goes and the amount of pressure that I'm applying so that the paint blends. Then I can go back on the top where that blend line is and add a little bit more of the ultramarine phthalo mix if I need to soften up where the two colors meet. So where you want to blend, you don't make the mark and leave it. Instead, you keep making the mark. So keep in mind that anytime you keep the knife going back over an area you've already applied, it's going to blend the two colors together. That's great when you want to create a gradation, but when you want to apply one color on top of another, you don't want to do that. So this next layer down in making that blend is just that phthalo blue and Indian yellow mixture. And at this point, there's very little of the ultramarine blue in there from that first application of blue at the top. So just gradually pulling it down without letting it get too thick. Because remember, we're going to be putting other colors on top of that to create that feeling of sunlit clouds and pull in some of that yellow and yellow-orange color. Now, I have the paper towel to my right, opened flat, and as I wipe it in between each application of color, I'm pulling it across the paper towel to take off any excess paint so that I don't get too many mixtures that I don't intend. So if you happen to pick up a little bit of that Terra Verde Egyptian violet color accidentally with your knife, simply wipe it on the paper towel. Also keep in mind that you do not have to bring that sky color right up against the no-tan color. You can leave a small space in between without it affecting the final painting, because you're going to have more paint coming in on top of that. And that can make you feel a little bit more comfortable about using that big knife more freely. As far as the size of the panel goes, this one is a 5x7. But if you feel more comfortable with a 6x8 or even an 8x10, use the size that feels most comfortable to you. When you're learning something new, don't mix everything else up at the same time. Limit the number of things that you're changing. So work with the scale that feels most comfortable. Now here I've put in some of the Indian yellow and white. You can see me picking up that very, very light Indian yellow and white. And not much on the back of the knife at all, and bringing it right up to that mixture of blue and yellow that is above it. Again, very thinly, so you're going to see me pull it down and keep it really thin so that it makes it easier to blend and to later pull other colors on top of it. So if you pick up any color that you don't want there, simply wipe the knife on the paper towel. Doesn't matter whether you're working on an easel or laying the panel flat, you can still work the same way. So if you're used to an easel, prop the painting up on the easel. Just make sure that you can lock the painting in on the easel so that it's not going to jump around with you when you touch it with the knife. Because if it's too loose when it's up on the easel, it's going to get a little frustrating. With really small ones, I find it's frequently easier when they're laying flat. So here you can see where I'm working that yellow up into the blue that's up above it. And I am doing that at a slight angle. So the ultramarine blue that's at the top is going to come down a little further where it's close to the tree and go up a little further on the right-hand side so that it's not a straight across line. That'll break it up some so that it's a little bit more visually interesting. Okay, also remember that as you're working, you can turn that panel around to reach into smaller spaces. We're going to do that here in just a second. So now we're pulling some more of that pure Indian yellow and white down towards the bottom. And you notice I just caught some of that violet with the knife. If that happens, wipe the knife off on the paper towel. And remember to, if you do catch any in the other area in the sky where you want it to stay unmixed, all you need to do is to pull it off with the knife, wipe the knife, and go back in. You can even it out after you do that. But notice how really small the amount of paint is I'm using each time. And just keep pulling that down to where you're almost touching that tree line. So now we're going to turn it so it's easier to get up into those little small spots. This works whether the painting is 4 by 6 inches or 4 by 6 feet. When I'm working on a large painting, I do exactly the same thing. I will flip that thing upside down on its edge, any which way it needs to go, so that the marks stay free. And when it's turned upside down like that, then it's very easy to work that yellow back down into the rest of the sky so that the blending feels more natural. Take your time on doing this and don't feel rushed. So I'm going to pull some more of that light yellow up into that tree line. And notice how much easier it is to get in there when I'm coming from this opposite direction. Turn the painting so that you can apply the paint with ease. There's no reason to make it hard on ourselves. One other thing that helps when you turn the painting upside down is if you also turn your reference upside down. It helps to release what we think we know, and instead we see what we actually see. So to be more accurate in our vision, it is extremely helpful to turn our reference and our painting upside down. 9 times out of 10, if you're having a hard time with a shape, that's what you need to do. So there you can see where I'm just about done with that tree line there. I've turned it sideways so that it's easier to get into the little indentations in there. So one of the things I want you to watch is that you keep those intervals a little bit uneven. They're pretty even right at the moment, and what I mean is by those little sections of the distant dense tree that pop up. And as we get towards the end of the painting, you'll see me break those up a little bit so they're not quite as regular. Remember that the eye likes difference. So we have a big sky hole that I've left open on that left-hand side of the tree. And just scooting the knife in there to very thinly apply some of that same light yellow. It is really thin. By keeping it that thin, it means that at the end, the very last thing I'm going to be able to do in that painting, I'm going to be able to pull some of the dark across that light without it becoming a muddy mess. Again, make sure that you're keeping that knife clean as you switch colors. Fold the paper towel as you go, and it becomes so much easier to not wear your paint all over your hands. So now I've picked up some of the very pinkish Montserrat yellow, Indian yellow mixture. So this is the most pink of the mixtures that we have on our palette. and I'm pulling it up in the basic shape of the area that has more pink in it than yellow. It looks garishly pink at this point, but it will not stay that way because we're going to mix it in to the underlying color that's in the sky already. So I laid it in very lightly with the knife held almost completely parallel to the panel. And now I'm going back in and blending. So that means I'm putting a little bit more pressure on it, and I'm not wiping my knife in between. I'm letting the colors blend. Because they're opposite, close complements to each other, they're going to create some more muted colors for the clouds. In between times, wipe your knife as needed so that you don't get too much of the pink pulling up in an area where you don't really want it. Up towards the top, that blue does not have that much of the pink in there, but it has a tiny little bit. So what looked like a fairly empty sky at first, we're going to add more variation to the subtleties that you saw in the photograph. So you can see how I'm pulling that pink up at an angle so that we have not a straight line, but a diagonal line, a softened diagonal line, almost a curve. And as needed, grab some of that phthalo blue and Indian yellow mixture and pull it in. And you can also pull back in some of the ultramarine blue and white as needed. So here you're doing a dance back and forth between the underlying colors that you blocked in and that Montserrat yellow mixture that we pulled across. So here I'm applying some of the ultramarine blue and white, the ultramarine phthalo blue and white mixture that we initially applied, and breaking down some of that cloud color that I've already put in so that it's broken up. We're not getting rid of all of it, but we are breaking up the bigger masses. So you can see here where you have little bits of blue that are showing through the pinker areas. Then we're going to do some of that same thing on the lower areas of the sky. So begin to blend that pink with the yellow. And you can work back and forth with any of those Montserrat orange and yellow mixtures that we created to create as many clouds or as few clouds as you want. But just remember that it will be more pinkish orange towards the horizon line than it will be further up. So to balance some of the strong pink, I'm going to pull some of the yellow and white mixture back into that section. So this is what I call the finesse stage. So you're going back and forth and dancing between two colors to make them blend and have soft edges where you want them softer and harder edges where you want to create the illusion of clouds. So I'm letting some of the yellow skip over and create little wisps of horizontal bands that will move up into the blue. Notice how light my touch is there and how much it's skipping back and forth. Now I'm going to pull some more of that yellow down and then pick up some of the phthalo blue Indian yellow mixture and pull that down into the yellow. So again, it's back and forth. Pull and blend until it becomes harmonious. And you'll notice how little of that original orange color is really remaining. Most of it has been blended into the underlying yellow or the underlying blue. Now, when I pull the knife this way from left to right, what happens is that it blends slightly in the direction of the striations of the clouds. So when you look at the photograph there in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see that there are little wispy clouds that are horizontal bands. Pulling the knife in the direction of those clouds helps to create those horizontal bands. So I've loaded the knife with some of that phthalo blue, Indian yellow mixture that's a really, really, really light blue. And I am pulling it that direction. And you can see where it's skipping across the paint that's underneath and creating the feeling of those bands of clouds. We'll be pulling those right on down. And again, just as everything else we put into the sky so far, we can do that dance back and forth, like I'm doing right here, to decide to blend in some areas and add a little bit more paint in others. So here I've pulled a little bit of the ultramarine blue and phthalo mixture in to pull back across the lighter blue. Dance back and forth. Then more of the phthalo blue and Indian yellow mixture going down towards the bottom. Down into the yellow and the yellow-orange section. A back and forth dance. Don't overthink this, and don't try to paint each single cloud exactly as you see them in the photograph. You're trying to create the experience that you see in the photograph, not a literal representation of that, not a photographic copy. As soon as you try to tighten up and make it exactly like what you see in the photograph, you're literally going to tighten up, and it will take you 4 hours to do it instead of 1. So all I'm doing now is pulling a little bit more of that ultramarine blue and white mixture in again, the ultramarine blue and phthalo and white mixture back in again. Remember I said I want that area to be at an angle, a soft curvilinear diagonal, so that it leads your eye up to the upper right-hand corner of the painting. And I'll work that back and forth until it feels natural, until those cloud bands look like they are moving from left to right. And that same movement is what's going to pull the viewer's eye around the whole picture plane and up to that upper left-hand corner. Notice at this point, I still have not gone in there to indicate or to paint all of those little small twigs. And one of the things that hangs up students a lot is trying to paint that many little tiny individual sticks on a tree, the little tiny limbs. Don't try to paint each one, just like not trying to paint each striation of the clouds. What you're going to do is create the illusion of those by letting the knife skip again in just a few minutes. So now I'm going to pull some of that phthalo blue and Indian yellow mixture a little further down. And again, have it skip so that we don't have one huge mass that's all the same color. Clouds move in bands, especially very, very high clouds that are also very distant. Notice that in between, I'm wiping that knife a lot because it picks up some of the underlying color. And then I'm going to go in between those cloud bands to emphasize that more horizontal direction of those clouds. right on down into the yellow-orange. So the yellow section and the yellow-orange section become the underpainting for all of those cloud bands, rather than trying to paint around each of the clouds to lay that in. So this last part is just developing those cloud bands before we move into the same sort of thing in the field and in the tree line. Now, what I'm applying right up there towards the top, remember we mixed some ultramarine blue and white that was just ultramarine blue and white. No phthalo at all. And I am adding that in as the wisps of clouds, really a contrail, that you see at the very top of the photograph. And it's a very, very light ultramarine blue and white. We'll zoom in so that you can see it. And then I'm pulling the knife from left to right, straight across to blend it in just a little bit. Now, as we move into working on the land, I'm using the smaller knife, the 61, to push up, it's that dance again, push up the violet into the sky. This is how we soften those edges. Remember I said we want to make them a little bit more irregular because they were too regular, the intervals between those tree masses and the tree masses themselves. And then I'm going to do the same thing at the edge of the big tree mass. You can see where I'm pulling off and then wiping the knife in between. And when I push that violet into the sky, it creates a softer, lighter section that mimics what happens when you've got lots of thin little limbs that are really close together at a distance. You can push it off into the sky, and then if you need to darken it up and make it a little bit more dense, you can come back in and do that. So now I've got the bigger knife again, and we're going to work on the field. I'm picking up the yellow ochre, the darkest of the yellow ochre and violet mixtures. It's that third color on the bottom. And I'm laying it in where from the top of the field down. So the field is right at the base of that distant tree line. And because that's very thick paint and the dark paint that's underneath is really thin, I can pull that down and let some of the darker violet show through in spaces, and it'll lay right on top without pulling up any of the dark from underneath. Then I'm getting some of the medium violet and yellow ochre mixture and using that to break up some of that dark mass, because there is a lighter area right where the field begins to meet the tree line in the distance. That's the area where it has a little bit more contrast. Not the area that's closest to us, but the area that's right underneath that distant tree line. So I have that medium valued violet and yellow ochre mixture, and I start right where it meets the tree line and pull it down, letting the edge towards the bottom be a little bit softer. Now I've got the lightest of the violet and yellow ochre mixtures. You know, it's yellow ochre that's just had the edge knocked off of it. And laying that in just underneath those trees. It doesn't take much at all. And that is going to indicate where there is light coming in and flooding from the distant setting sun. It's not a huge contrast, but it's just enough to create that illusion of light. And because they are close complements, yellow ochre is basically a dulled yellow. And we have the violet. violet and yellow are complementary colors. The fact that they're complements is going to push them apart, even though the paint that we mixed is still relatively dull. It's going to look more intense than it might otherwise. So if you need to, lay a little bit more of the paint on top and maybe keep it a little thicker. Exaggerate that difference just a little bit. Remember that when people look at a painting from a distance, it needs to have a little greater contrast than you might think when you're on top of the painting and making the painting. So I've softened the bottom edge of that line of light. And where I need to, I can go back in and break it up a little bit. So now I have my terra and violet mixture that is more green than violet. And I'm pulling it in on top of the dark no-tan color in that big tree mass and letting it come out and skip into the sky in very irregular movements. So again, I'm holding that knife parallel to the panel, almost completely flat. And notice I turn it so that I can pull the knife the direction the foliage grew. So there's some evergreens in there. There actually are still leaves in that hedgerow and some old cedars. So you can see where I picked up a little bit of lighter value. All I had to do to get it off was to use the knife. Pull it off with the knife. Then I can go back in with a darker violet and fix that place. Wipe the knife and go in with my more green terra and violet mixture on top of that, and it will correct where I pulled in a little bit of white. Now, up at the top, remember I said I was going to create that irregular feeling of lots and lots of foliage? I have the violet and yellow ochre mixture because it is getting more lit than the huge dense mass of the tree. So again, I'm holding that knife almost parallel and I'm pulling from the no-tan that I've already put in across into the sky color. Remember that sky color right there is applied really thinly. And by not applying a whole lot of pressure, I can begin to break those sky holes up a little bit, break up the no-tan a little bit, so that it reads more like a very dense area of twigs. And I'm pulling some more of the green violet down in at the bottom. We'll zoom in a minute so that you can see just how subtle that is. And you're not going to be able to see it too far away, but when you get close, you'll be able to see differences between the very, very dark violet and the very dark green violet. Pulling just a little bit of that green violet into the foreground of the field. So here at the end, the last thing that I'm doing is just beginning to break up that big mass of the tree on the far left. So I'm going to pull some sky color back in, and I'm laying it in just like I laid in the color for the tree. So I'm pulling off some of the violet and then going back in with some of the yellow so that that area is more irregular and not so massive. And I can play back and forth with that between the yellow and the violet to break the shape up and leave some more small sky holes peeping through. Now I've got the lighter of the deep green-violet colors and pulling that across that same area, wiping between all the colors. Now some of the yellow ochre and violet, because that is a warmer section where it's being hit more by light. So dance back and forth between those two colors until you've broken up that big mass some. Remember, you can pull off where you need to And if you need to soften an edge, just use the tip of the knife to do so. And don't forget to breathe. This is the point where a lot of people forget to breathe in and out. So remember to breathe. Remember to turn the painting as you go so that you can work from the angle and the direction that is most easy to apply the paint. And if I need to, I can go back from the opposite direction from the sky into those tree line intervals and break them up a little bit more so they're not quite the same all the way across. And I'm going to pick up some of the ochre and violet, and last but not least, begin to break up the right-hand side of that tree mass. Break that up until it feels comfortable to you. You can go back and forth with the yellow ochre and violet mixture until you create that illusion to the degree that you want to. Here's our final painting. Now it's your turn to dive in.